Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is MAJ Ash Holzmann. He is a horror writer, satirist, poet, artist, and psychological operations officer in the U.S. Army Special Operations community. It's important to state that the opinions expressed by Ash are his own and not representative of the Department of Defense or the United States Army. And special thank you, Ash, for coming on. We are especially interested to talk with current military information operators, psychological operations officers, and bridge the gap between the military community, researchers, policymakers, et cetera. So special thank you as an active duty officer coming on to the program.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to be here. Thank you.
You bet. So you are the first psychological operations officer to be on the podcast. Noteworthy achievement for the Cognitive Crucible. Could you describe to our audience a little bit more the connection between psychological operations, information operations, and the community in general?
Yes. There's doctrinal definitions established by the joint forces and everything, but I really like a definition that Colonel Mushter, Jeremy Mushter, told us last year during a briefing at the Command and General Staff College, where he said that psychological operations forces are, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm trying to get it, but calling us masters of influence, and that we're the core of information warfare as we define ourselves. We exploit psychological vulnerabilities through sophisticated influence techniques blended with all forms of multimedia across overt, clandestine, and support to military deception. And that's us as far as what we do. We used to include in our definition the concept of white, gray, and black, where you can have a white PSYOP, which is very, as we like to reference with that, vanilla, where you're really trying to make some good also with that. Usually it's attributed to the United States openly, but then you have your gray, usually that's through partner forces, as we like to say, and then you have your black, which is non-attributed, and we don't acknowledge the existence of those. But we've shied away from that, and really we're getting into more of just the influence in general, and whatever that comes out as is what it comes out as, and you can blend them. You really don't want the enemy, whoever that may be, to be able to pick it up as easily, and that's the real reason we want to make sure that we look at attribution. And when we look at the information operations as a whole and the related information related capabilities, sorry, that was a lot of fluency. PSYOP's really one of the mechanisms to add nuance to an operation, but also to amplify effects. A cyber attack on a single entity is great, but what are you doing for your targeting process in that? And what would happen if you hit that target on Friday instead of Monday? What if it was the general's computer instead of just this private's computer? All sorts of stuff. The nuance is really what PSYOP cares about, and understanding when to do stuff, how to do it, framing it. And I think we'll get more into the nuance through the course of this conversation, which should be fun.
Yeah, fantastic. So you are not a FA-30. Could you talk a little bit about what an FA-30 is and how that differs from a psychological operations officer?
I could talk about how I would define an FA-30. I don't want to speak for them as a community.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
Essentially an FA-30, and especially in being a PSYOPer, an FA-30 is essentially someone who brings all of the information related capabilities together underneath a single plan. So an FA-30 might have a PSYOPer on his or her team, but also maybe a cyber EW person. Now we're calling it CEMA. But on top of that, they might have civil affairs attached or space operators attached as well, and the other related capabilities that might intersect with whatever the mission may be. And information operations, their goal is to build one cohesive plan through integrating all of those capabilities. And that's really where their strengths lies as facilitators. As we're getting into the information warfare era and entering great power competition again, we're seeing a lot of organizations standing up similar capabilities. Cyber Command is going hard into the information warfare space, and so is the Psychological Operations Regiment, and also 1st IO Command, and 1st Special Forces Command as well. And I personally believe that there's a space for all of us to do this kind of stuff and this kind of work. And there should be a psychological operations oriented information warfare task force, but there should also be a cyber oriented information warfare task force with maybe a couple PSYOPers on it and some 1st IO Command personnel attached. And similarly, why not have other complementary organizations? I think if we want to achieve victory, the secret sauce is really looking at the past and seeing how we've done it before. And when we've done it before successfully, we treated it as if we were all on the same team and we were all Americans. And I think that's the goal, is to be on the same team.
So when we were chatting before we started recording here, you were mentioning to me that there's been a good bit of change within the psychological operations community, within the psychological operations regiment recently. Could you describe some of those changes?
Yes. So recently, and this is actually what I wrote my thesis on last year, is we've basically done a .mil PF change recommendation, which is essentially a way that we create change in the military. And that's restructuring all sorts of stuff right now. And it's really interesting, really fascinating. We're trying to essentially leverage ourselves for great power competition. Previously, before that, the last great change was standing up 2 active duty psychological operations groups. And during that period, we were also trying to stand up our own command. Eventually, 1st Special Forces Command stood up out of that, and that's where all the Special Forces groups and the CA Brigade, the active duty CA Brigade, and both active duty PSYOP groups reside. But there's actually 4 PSYOP groups, and the other 2 are underneath a command called USACAPOC, and that's where the reserve PSYOP groups are with the reserve CA components. And separating that and essentially allocating them to be conventional force support, even though a lot of them do a lot of special operations support and attached to several missions that I don't think we can really talk about. They still made that separation, and it was actually roughly the time we became an official branch is when that happened. We actually call it the Great Divorce.
This is
the term.
This is what time period?
2006.
Okay.
2006 is when it started being referenced as that as well. Alfred H Paddock Jr. He's famous as a PSYOPer, but also for a thesis that he wrote decades ago now on the history of special operations. And before he wrote that, for some reason, a lot of the history of special forces would often leave out the significance of psychological warfare in that history. Special forces was initially, I don't know what you would call it, but basically a subcomponent of psychological warfare. And if you read the works and the stuff written down in interviews and everything of Wild Bill Donovan, who was really like the founder of special forces, but also and great part, a very big contributor to psychological warfare. He used to reference a thing called the tip of the spear. And these days we say the tip of the spear, and it's like a logistician term, but it's also a direct action term. But when he was saying the tip of the spear, he was actually referencing psychological warfare. That was the actual tip, is getting information into the environment first before you had boots on ground. And looking at Paddock and his writings, he was acknowledging stuff like that. He actually wrote a history of special warfare. It's a great book. And when the Great Divorce happened, he was still an active writer, and he named it the divorce, and he warned about what could happen from that. And who's to say what's going to happen? But I do think at some point we will have to address the separation, because any regiment divided is a regiment divided.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff, and we will be sure to have links in the show notes to all of these references that Ash is mentioning. So you mentioned your thesis. This is from the Army Command and Staff College, is that correct?
Correct.
What are the bottom line recommendations coming out of your thesis?
I meshed a lot of things together. So if we want to achieve victory in large-scale combat operations again, and in multi-domain operations, and do so in an optimal way, where we're actually empowering information warfare concepts so that we're saving the lives of ourselves and our allies, then we should probably look at the history of when we've done that before. And so I took it as an opportunity to look into psychological operations history. And I went all the way back to 2560 BC. And I separated everything I could find into essentially 4 categories of eras. And it went up to 1903, and that was the first era. Then it was, I called that the pre-global war era. And then we went into the World War era, which was 1903 to 1945. Then the Cold War, which ended in 1985, not the actual Cold War, but the era, because that brought us into the modern war era as far as psychological operations and influence is concerned. And 1985 was a big year for us. That was another year of change. There's a pattern here. And that was when the 1985 Psychological Operations Master Plan was published, which is both a really good thing and in some ways a bad thing, because one of the things that came out of that was a necessitating of growth for PSYOP. It was actually mandated by I want to say President Reagan is the reason it was done. It was taken, like accomplished or whatever. But when it was finished, it brought out good things, like it created an NCO Corps for PSYOP, which hadn't happened before that. Anytime we had non-commissioned officers or even enlisted personnel, they were attached and augmented and given a really quick crash course before they deployed with us. And it was usually signals personnel, things like that. But then we had an NCO Corps. But then there's also other things where we said that we needed a general officer and that we needed to form a command. And that's been this real big obsession. And because that's an obsession, we've at times stressed the need for a general over the need for good doctrine, good training, language capability, stuff like that. Things that are, in my opinion, more relevant. I attached all of that to the DCR I mentioned, the .mil.pf change recommendation, and said, hey, here's a way for us to optimize what already exists and to accomplish the things that we've accomplished successfully in the past. And that was essentially the thesis. It's kind of long. It's still being reviewed 6 months.
Wow, that's fantastic stuff. I'd love for you to provide to the audience some additional snippets out of your thesis or out of your personal experience, to the extent that you can share, some stories or vignettes that help paint the picture of what's possible when psychological operations are deployed effectively, perhaps some counter examples if you can think of them as well. But just being able to share why psychological operations is an especially important consideration, both historically, and parlay that into today's world as well.
Absolutely. I think something that's really important to stress up front that a lot of people don't usually talk about when framing the conversations like this is the nature of propaganda in general, and how it seems to be, especially from the perspective of philosophers, to be a natural reaction. It's a natural social evolution, and there's plenty of philosophers who disagree with its application, but I believe most of them accept that it naturally occurred out of respect to democracy. And you can really see that in 1776 as the Revolutionary War in America was kicking off. You had individuals like Samuel Adams and Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine's Common Sense was an excellent piece of propaganda, as it defined the goals for the common man. It gave them arguments to repeat in bars and in private life. It basically told them why the Revolutionary War was being fought. It was just as important to the Revolutionary War as Mein Kampf was to the Germans later during the Second World War. And that's not something I'm necessarily drawing like a direct comparison to Thomas Paine and Hitler, but it's important to see how a single book, a single item could frame so much of a conflict. And Napoleon also identified the same thing. Napoleon famously, or even infamously, used the media as a way to essentially frame every action he did. He would send bulletins, and the only way that you can get information on the Napoleonic Wars from the perspective of Napoleon was from Napoleon, and he knew that. So every time information came out, it was framed by him, sometimes him personally. And so there was actually like this art to deciphering what really happened by reading Napoleon's bulletins back in the day. But getting back to the philosophy of it, these actions were necessary because in a democracy, you can't just order the people to do whatever you want them to anymore. You have to communicate with them as a government. And if you're communicating with them, you're trying to sway them to an opinion. And the whole concept of public opinion and swaying the opinion really engrossed aspects of the media. It came to eventually public affairs spawned out of that, which is also another information related capability that will fall under information operations in FA30s. But you look at how it was starting to be applied later. That's when you get into the stuff like Mein Kampf, where it could be used dangerously and to incite and to create violent revolution. And I do think that is the slippery slope of understanding when to use it, when to not use it. Interestingly enough, in the First World War, we, as the United States, we had the Committee on Public Information, and George Creel, who led it, was a journalist and brought in a ton of journalists and had some amazing effects. In fact, Edward Bernays, who wrote the first book, essentially the first propaganda philosophy, but also defining book after that war, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And that's another thing that also comes up time and again that I always find interestingly. And one of the things I like to say is when a special forces individual or ranger is famous, it's because they're famous for being a special forces person or ranger. But when a psychological operations professional is famous, it's because they were actually famous. And you can go through like the list of individuals from Edward Bernays to the Rockefellers to Disney to Ronald Reagan to Clark Gable. You name the people, like there's very significant people who were famous after they were cyber's. Some of them were famous before they were doing the craft. Dr. Seuss was a part of the first motion picture unit and even had interactions with the Ghost Army of World War II.
I'm struck how the psychological warfare effort, and the other side of the coin, the commercial marketing and perception management efforts, which are part of our everyday life in how corporations market to us, how they're really opposite sides of the same coin, but there is arguably a spectrum where it's very difficult to separate the legal and understood kinds of persuasion efforts commingle with illegal or covert psychological operations efforts, especially today as we are in this era of, like you said, great power competition below the level of armed conflict.
And that's an interesting thing that's evolved as well with time. Edward Bernays and the individuals from the First World War, interestingly enough, entered civilian life and essentially established modern PR as we know it, public relations as we know it. And a lot of the post-World War II era individuals also went on to use what they learned in war to become marketers. Bloss, as an example, from the Ghost Army in World War II, which was a deception unit. He ended up becoming a very famous person, sold his company for $700 million back when that was even more money. Bill Bloss, that was his name. But there's so many applications to it too. Interestingly enough, during the First World War, so we can actually trace the lineage back to a single individual in America, and his name was Hebert Blankenhorn, and he was a part of the Committee on Public Information in the First World War. And at the time, the committee actually was it existed to incite Americans, and it was aimed at getting American support for the conflict, and that was what they wanted to influence. And they thought it was ungentlemanly to do that to the enemy. And Bear Blankenhorn said, he was a journalist. There's another pattern. He was a journalist, and he believed that you should use this on the enemy. And he enlisted in the army, became an officer, then commissioned, and through back channel relationships that he had. And he then stood up the first psychological warfare organization as we would know it today. And he's the first psy-war professional. Once he did that, post that war, the Germans recognized the importance of propaganda, and they actually attributed Allied propaganda to the reason they lost. And going into the Second World War, we stood up a lot of stuff. The Office of War Information, the Office of Strategic Services, which after the Second World War split and essentially became the CIA, psychological warfare, and under that at the time was Special Forces, which then eventually that flipped. And then the third organization was the United States Information Agency, which existed until 1999. We thought that once the Cold War was over, we wouldn't need it anymore. And you can read dozens and dozens of theses that say we need it back. And I think that's an interesting thing as well. I think one of the go-tos that we share a lot in the psychological operations regiment is Edward Lansdale, who is also claimed by other influence organizations. He wasn't just ours, but he was an OSS operator in the Second World War, and then he continued to work in the influence field after that. And there was this one time when he was in the Philippines in the 50s, going against one of the supporting the efforts of the Filipino government at the time. One of the problems they had was the terrorists, as they defined them, were operating a lot at night. And so Edward Lansdale had done his homework, and he understood that there was some folklore that he might be able to take advantage of. So in order to stop night operations, what they did is he and his partner force that he was basically just assisting camped out on a route that they knew the enemy was going on at night. And they waited for a foot patrol to pass. And when the last individual was there, they grabbed him really quickly, stabbed 2 holes in his neck, and bled him out right there. In Filipino lore, and this is still true, to this day, you can ask your Filipino friends, like, what's this? They have a creature called the aswang, And the Aswang are essentially vampires, and they steal people at night, and they'll steal children. And Edward Lansdale took advantage of that. They conducted that type of operation 2 or 3 times, and all night operations by the enemy stopped for months, like 100% stopped. So that was a successful psychological operation.
Wow.
I do have to add context that would technically be illegal for us to do today. So we aren't allowed to do something like that. But at the time, it was accepted.
That's awesome stuff. Man.
Another example could be OPS 33 during the Vietnam War. Now, there was a lot of not successful psychological operations in that conflict, but there was also some really great stuff too. OPS 33, they actually had some fast-moving speedboats, and they would take farmers to those locations, knowing that they would likely be used as sources, or they would take other individuals that were used as enemy sources, and they would take them to the island, and they would pretend to try to bring them onto their side. But they knew that they were double agents, and they would just expose them to this entire fake unit that didn't exist. And so the enemy, the Viet Cong, were actually looking for this unit. The whole conflict, they were spending a lot of man hours trying to figure out what is this unit, and it keeps pulling our guys in to try to get them to come over. It keeps trying to establish intelligence apparatus and everything, but it was a fake island. It wasn't a fake island, but it was all just this large deception. I thought that was really interesting. They would also do a lot of electronic warfare at the time. They established a lot of TTPs that were really interesting, like surfing, where they would come onto Radio Hanoi the minute the broadcast would end, and they would just pick it back up, and they would catch a few people. They would get a few listeners in that way, or they would hijack it, and they would hijack the signal, and roughly 50% of the people who tuned in would actually tune into the fake one, and they would just sow misinformation into the environment and just doing really interesting stuff. The real secret to psychological operations is that there is legal boundaries, but there are no rules. And if you can get an effect and save American lives, allied lives, by having the enemy go here or there instead of direct conflict, then you're doing your job well.
What is your recommendation to the general public, to Americans, to the West, as we are in this insidious environment where there are all kinds of persuasion campaigns being published into the discourse, so that people can be aware, mindful of these kinds of efforts? What would you suggest to, you're a father, what are the kinds of things that you'll be educating your kids and loved ones about during today's challenging times?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one thing to try to do is one, be educated on it. And I know that's a difficult thing to say and just assume, like, I spend my life researching this stuff and trying to understand it. Like there's one organization called, I believe they're called Ad Fontes, and they actually have, it looks like a bell curve of sources and media sources and how biased they are. And there's a box essentially at the top, the green box, I believe, where those are the most balanced sources, and they're not trying to sway your opinion. They're trying to give you news. Sometimes they'll frame it a little to the left or a little to the right. But there's also apps out there that tell you whether or not something leans left or right, and that's important. But another important thing to learn is just who owns X media company. Oh, that's all underneath this larger conglomerate. And that is unfortunately a reality of the whole thing. If you look at who owns Lionsgate Films, the Chinese do now. They purchased it. And who owns 90% plus of all of the domestic movie theaters in America? Well, the Chinese own that too now. And there's all sorts of stuff that's happening that, if you're not paying attention, kind of coasts under the radar. But that's the game. That's the great game. as we like to call it sometimes. And it's not always easy to find a truth, but if you're looking for the truth and you are, are careful on your journey and you're not going into the rabbit holes of conspiracy, that I do think that it is possible to navigate that.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice, and I try to communicate to my two daughters and others that I know at a bare minimum, get your information from more than one source so that you've got some kind of point of comparison so that you can, start being a little bit critical about the information that you're receiving.
Absolutely. And we shouldn't discount some of the just old style teaching and instruction. Like philosophy is important, logic is important, and rhetoric and the art of argument. And if we build our children up to understand that and to be objective, then I believe it's a little easier. The reason PSYOP works, the reason deceptions work and influence works, is because it appeals to aspects of us that are not logical, like McGruber's principle, which is a deception technique. All it is feeding information into the environment that the enemy already assumes is true. And so all you're doing is playing off of what they want reality to be. And then you do the opposite. And that's no different from anything at ranger school when they tell you, hey, man, the enemy doesn't want to go into the swamp. So you have to go into the swamp because they don't think you'll be in the swamp sleeping. But that's the secret to winning that tactical advantage is make your life suck a little more than the enemy's life is going to suck. And I think some of that's just the nature of influence too, and a way that we can get around it is just understanding all those things.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to try to wrap up and ask you if you could recommend a book that you think is especially good for our audience if they want to learn more about the kinds of things that we've been discussing.
Absolutely. I think the go-to I always try to start people on is Munitions of the Mind. It's by Philip M. Taylor, and it's great. It goes into the history of propaganda. It's a lot of more of the ancient stuff, but understanding that really frames what's happening today, going back to the Catholic Church. And a lot of influence centuries ago was through churches and through religion. And yes, there was also the military applications. Those were usually through the genius of a general like Alexander the Great, or Caesar, or even the Roman Empire in general as it was going against different nations, I guess you would call them, in their great conflicts. But also back to the Catholic Church, like that's where we get the word propaganda, is the propagation of the faith, which was an organization that the Catholic Church applied to spreading their message. And seeing how that evolved over time into today, I think really frames everything.
All right. And with that, Major Ash Holzmann, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.